Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. This is episode 347, and today's guest is Joe Caruso, investor and mentor. Lots of people know of Joe as an angel investor, but when I think of Joe, I think of a mentor to so many great entrepreneurs and a major supporter of the Boston startup ecosystem. If you go through Joe's portfolio of investments from his Bantam Group website, it will give you a strong perspective to the depth of his connections to the Boston tech scene. This podcast, I need to tell you, is a little bit different than my normal format. We start off by talking about his role as a mentor, and during that conversation, we weave in his background, like leaving high school before getting his diploma and enrolling into Northeastern, plus he shares so much great advice throughout the conversation. What I found to be incredibly fun was the walk down memory lane and getting to hear the inside story of some of his investments in companies like HubSpot, Constant Contact, Carbonite, and LevelUp, plus the missed opportunity with DraftKings. And one of my favorite stories actually has nothing to do with tech. He was on the board of a company that invented the Frappuccino. Oh, you think that might be Starbucks? But you have to listen to find out. Okay, quick side note. Did you know that you can watch our podcast interviews on YouTube? Head over to youtube.com/VentureFizz to access our channel, and from there, you'll find a full library of content, including a podcast playlist. While you are there, please make sure you click on the subscribe button. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Joe. Joe, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to do it. And good seeing you. It's been a while, but good seeing you again. Yeah.
Good seeing you too. We've known each other for a long time. Like, I think we first met at one of the events in Boston, one of the startup events. And, you've always been kind of like this anchor, at least I consider an anchor to the Boston tech ecosystem in terms of what you've done from so many different levels. And we're going to talk about those different things as an investor. But how I wanted to kick off this conversation is I also think of you as a strong mentor, like somebody that helps legitimately helping entrepreneurs thrive and succeed. So I wanted to talk to you about that piece of your background and like why is it that such a strong piece of who you are, and why is it so important for entrepreneurs to find a good mentor?
Yeah. So can you have a psychiatrist co-host this? Because
right.
But I am appreciative of the fact that the persona you have in mind is that of mentor and not investor, because that is how I think of myself. You know, there's kind of this old joke: if you want money, ask for advice, and if you want advice, ask for money. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's a common bromide. And there's an element of truth to that, actually. But on the mentoring side, I think there are probably several routes. One is I have always viewed entrepreneurship almost as a form of religion. It's a way of life. It's a mindset. And to me, the elements of the mindset that are important: if you see a problem, don't bitch about it, fix it. If things aren't going well for you, don't blame someone else, take responsibility and solve it. And so that's sort of one theme. You know, I don't even know if I somewhat sarcastically call it an entrepreneurial gig and investment, is I was 10 years old. I bought a paper route that I wasn't supposed to be able to deliver until I was 12. But I convinced the guy that if I gave him some money, he'd let me deliver. He would make the profit on the paper and I would keep all the tips. So it was a rev share deal before there were rev share deals.
Which I love. At 10 years old, you're
And
figuring
it
it
was
out.
like, and I know I might have been 9, I might have been 11.
Right. Doesn't matter.
You know, I don't have my hand on a Bible here. So it kind of goes back to that. And the other aspect, and this is maybe why, while I've done well financially, I don't do as well as I could have or should have, is I think the guy that has a food truck that goes and gets a second food truck is just as much an entrepreneur as Elon Musk. Now, oh, Joe, you're crazy. But there's that gene. And that second food truck may in fact be a bigger accomplishment for him than SpaceX.
Yeah.
And I'm not belittling, I mean, shit, Elon Musk.
Right.
I mean, I'm not trying to at all say he doesn't deserve what he has or he isn't better than most people, but it isn't that different. And I'm going way off the ranch here, off the trail, but there's one story I remember, not story, but a story I have told that goes back to maybe when it was actually about the same age. I was in either the fifth or the sixth grade. I used to go into the Museum of Science every weekend because I was interested in learning stuff. And I'd take the tea in, and I was walking to where the Museum of Science is, and there was a homeless guy who found a cigarette butt in the gutter, and he picked it up, and he had a look of elation on his face that just stuck with me. I'm going to show my age now. I got home, Saturday newspaper. There's a picture of Ari Onassis. I don't know if you know Onassis, Jackie Onassis's husband. He's a
Got it.
multi-billionaire oil guy.
Right.
He had just closed some deal. He bought a company for $5 billion or $1 billion. I don't know, something that was major economic success.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw his picture on the front of the Globe, and I said, that looks just like the guy that found the cigarette butt. Again, I have this thing. There was no, whatever neuron activity was going on in his head was identical. This is me, recharacterizing it decades later. And you might say, what has all of this got to do with mentoring? It's this mindset I have is anyone who has the initiative to want to go do something for themselves, I'm going to help them. Now, will I give a little more time if I think it's a Nobel Prize winning cancer cure company than I will if it's a guy with a food truck? Yeah, I don't want to state it in too exaggerated a fashion, but I will not be dismissive of the guy with the food truck. I mean,
Right.
it just, because someday, Ray Kroc, well, I guess Ray Kroc never owned a hamburger stand. He came through a different route, but, Ron Shaich had one cookie store.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Look what he turned into, a very successful, well-known guy because he had that gene.
Do you think it's born or just naturally
Yeah, boy, now that, yes, no, I mean, so I have this defect where I have an opinion and advice on every subject known to man, even if I know nothing about the subject and have no data. So that's my flaw.
That's your disclaimer.
That's my disclaimer. But that question is one I cannot, I mean, I don't have my usual, oh, yes, no, go right, go left. It's a big mushy.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination. There's some genetic component.
It's a combination. Yeah.
But,
I mean, I've talked to 340 plus entrepreneurs and investors on this podcast, and you'll hear some that come from an entrepreneurial roots and some that don't, and just
I can't find I can't point to the thing. I'm sure some of it is genetic, some of it is upbringing. My father was big on being responsible for what you do. But the element of luck and circumstance that change, I mean, I can go back, and this may be not appropriate for this podcast, but I literally, people are going to think this is exaggerated. I can point to a single moment of time, and I can plot things that from the school I went to, the job I got, the career move I made later, and everyone can, if had that instance not occurred, my life would have been totally different. Now, it might have been better. I'm not saying it was good or bad, but, and so, again, I'm rambling too much, but
I think you're right, though.
we
It
do
does
have
play into it.
tendencies. I think the other thing, and this may be the genetic component, And this I kind of steal from a friend of mine, Michael Kaufman, who used to use this expression 20 years ago. Labrador retrievers retrieve. That's what they do.
Right. I love
So
that.
the metaphor I use with people is Labrador retrievers retrieve. Butterflies get pollen out of flowers. If you want to get pollen out of a flower, do not send the Labrador.
Right.
Not a good idea. If you want to fetch the newspaper at the end of the driveway, do not send the butterfly. So it isn't that one is better than the other. So which is better? I don't know. If you want to pick up something heavy, the Labrador is better. If you want something that's pretty, the butterfly is better. And that's sort of my attitude towards entrepreneurship and why I put the food truck guy and Elon Musk in the same genre.
That's
They
awesome.
are
I love that.
different. They are dramatically different. They, at
Mhm.
one level, they have nothing to do with each other. And at another level, they are identical.
Let's go through your background, like your experience. So you talked about, being entrepreneurial as a kid with the paper route. From what I gathered, you dropped out of high school and enrolled in
Yeah.
Northeastern.
Yeah. So there's another perfect example. And I remember this happening in the sixth grade is, so as a kid, I was smart. That is not bragging. That is not ego. To me, being smart is like having freckles. So that is something I will say is genetic. Okay. So I did very well in school, grammar school, straight A's, in high school, went to Roxbury Latin, was doing real well. Got bored as shit. And I remember going to my mother. It was in August of where I was about to go into my senior year. I said, I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to go to college. She says, you can't go to college. You haven't graduated. I said, I'm going to college. And I took the train into Northeastern and I pounded. I don't remember the exact details, but I pounded on enough doors that I found somebody. And again, I was fortunate enough. I had high SAT, what would they call it? It wasn't called SAT at the time. College boards or whatever they were called at the time. I got whatever, 1,500, 1,600. And I said, I want to go. And he looked at my, he says, we'll give you a chance, but if you flunk out, you don't have a degree. You're going to have to go back. And I said, I don't care. I'm doing it. And I did. So now that again is that genetic or self? I don't know. Because my mother and father were very conservative, so there wasn't an entrepreneurial gene in their bodies. In fact, later on in life, when I took a job at Teradyne, I had an offer from AT&T. And as I tell people, I literally thought my mother was going to have a heart attack. That I
How do you
turned
turn
down
down AT&T?
AT&T.
Like,
She absolutely, I can't tell you how much pressure she put on me of how stupid I was. I didn't, and it'd be like a kid today getting an offer from Apple and Google and Amazon, and he ends up
to go to
going,
a startup
yeah,
with,
going to a startup or something. And
because
again,
Teradyne at the
Paradigm wasn't a
time,
startup. It was 100 people, but it was
right,
it was a crappy little company.
compared to AT&T, the blue
Compared to
chip of the blue
AT&T, it was
chip.
non-existent.
Right.
And
And I'm sure explaining to your mother, automatic test equipment for the semiconductor industry was like, what?
well, I didn't even know. Okay, so and I can go ramble with stories there, but that actually is one. Remember when I said how your life's path? I would not have had a job at Teradyne had I not seen a 3x5 card posted on a cork board when I was heading back to my dorm room.
And this is when you were at HBS?
This is when I was at HBS.
Right. Okay.
I would
Wow.
not have gone to HBS if it weren't for this event I mentioned. My boss at MITRE, I was torn whether to continue in double E or get an MBA. I concluded that getting A's and B's in math and physics didn't mean you were a good engineer. And I learned that on my co-op job. The fellow who worked the half of the year I didn't, I would go sit at his desk and I'd look at the design work he did, and it blew me away. Now, I had grades far better than his, but I couldn't do what he did. I can't explain it. So is that being smart or being stupid? I don't know. So called, trying to decide. So I applied for some double E advanced degrees. In fact, I got a Hughes Fellowship at UCLA, which I didn't accept. I eventually didn't accept. Applied to Harvard, not even knowing whether or not they offered an MBA. I called Harvard University I never heard of Harvard Business School, didn't know it existed. And when Northeastern found out about it, that they offered me a program where I would get a combination master's in double E, master's in business, and they gave me a fellowship where I would earn enough money on the fellowship to pay for the tuition. I accepted it. I was done. I accepted it. In that instance I was telling about, I'm sitting at the secretary's typewriter at MITRE, typing my rejection. Oh, I then, after having accepted, a month later, I got accepted to Harvard Business School. Typing things called typewriters, you know what they used to read. You can read about them in the history books. And my boss comes walking by. He said, "What are you doing?" I says, I never thought I would be turning down Harvard. I said, this is like mind blowing. A, I never thought I'd get into Harvard, and B, never thought I'd turn it down. Actually, he said, what? And I explained the story. I said, I can't. I already accept. He says, you got to tell Northeastern, no, you got to accept this. I said, I can't. I already told him. So he took me to a couple of people. I forget. There was a VP at iTech and Raytheon. I don't know. He took me up and down 128 and explained my dilemma to a couple of high-level executives at these big companies. And to a person, they giggled. It's like, what's the question?
Are you crazy?
Yeah, that's right. It's like and so I went back, I said, I don't know what the hell it is, but this Harvard Business School thing must be something special. And my boss convinced me Northeastern would survive without me. I mean,
Right.
and I didn't have a big ego, but I had a big
Well, it's
feeling.
more of a,
Make a commitment, you keep it.
yeah, that's a show of your
That was the
character.
mindset. You know what?
Yeah.
I made the
Mhm.
decision.
Right.
My,
I
you know,
told them, I
I
committed.
told
That's
them I
your
can't do it.
character.
So I went back and I told the dean of engineering, who had cobbled this thing together, and I was all, apologetic and mumbling, and he said, "You made the right decision," and I was like blown away. He was
Yeah.
fully understanding. I think his name was Scott. Never mind. I got to go check now on that, see if my memory is correct. So, there you talk about luck, genes, whatever. But had my boss not seen me at a typewriter that day,
Mm-hmm.
I would not have gone to HBS. Had I not gone to HBS, I wouldn't have seen that 3x5 card. I wouldn't have gone to Teradyne. Further circumstance, at Teradyne, a guy I was working with had gotten laid off. And it was about a year later, I got laid off. And he called me when he heard about the layoff. He was trying to see if he could get a used oscilloscope for the startup he was involved with. He said, "It's just had a layoff. They must be cutting back. Maybe they'll be selling some used equipment." So I went to visit him, and it was him and another guy. And we had a couple of meetings. They asked me to come run the company. Again, that would not have happened had my boss not. So I went in, company I ran for quite a number of years.
Is this Cyborg or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
They had a consumer product. I brought it into stroke and spinal cord injury. It was pivots on steroids, stroke and spinal cord injury, then morphed again and got into laboratory and factory automation. The long story in and of itself. But years later, Cyborg blew up. Long story about board responsibilities, the role of venture capitalists versus entrepreneurs. There's another whole part of my life I can talk about. But during that time, we had a competitor in the Midwest. I always would reach out to my competitors. Coincidentally, after Cyborg blew up, a guy I had met at that competitor needed someone to run a company he had just bought. That caused me to enter into where I ended up doing turnarounds for a 12-year period. And again,
Right.
I'm going back to that noontime at that typewriter.
Yeah.
So
Connecting
this
the
isn't
dots.
like, oh, had I majored in history instead of this, my life would have been different. These are
Mhm.
specific forks in the road, each conditional on a prior fork that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the prior fork.
Yeah.
So, sorry, you got me. It's one of the things I talk too much, but so that's I don't even know how we got on this. You asked me how I got
Well,
to.
you did a great job. I wanted to walk through
So
your
the
career
so the
and
the
connect the
mentoring
dots.
thing came from after Cyborg blew up. I concluded it was a year or two later, actually, that when I look back, I did some stupid things. When you're in your 30s, you think you know everything, and had I had a good mentor, I concluded that the thing wouldn't have blown up. I made some rookie mistakes. I made certain assumptions about what I could or couldn't do, given the presence of investors and board members. And that's when I basically said, you know what, I'm going to make sure that other people in my situation don't screw up the way I screwed up. And so that kind of was the underlying genesis.
Got it. Okay.
Um, and it is like, I'm going to say, religion for me. My wife kids me about it, sometimes chides me about it. But that's my mission. I mean, some people are going to solve climate change and some people are going to do much bigger and better things than I do. That's my little, as I tell people, I get up in the morning, run to the end of the driveway, fetch the newspaper and bring it back. That's what I do.
That's
And I
awesome.
and I can't not do it. If you ever have had a Labrador, try throwing something and have it not fetch it.
Right.
Impossible.
Right.
Absolutely impossible. And that's me with entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously recognized because I have that perception of you from the first time I met you, and like that wasn't something that we planned to really talk about to the extent that we did, but you obviously, connected the dots perfectly on that. So as I'm doing my research for my podcast, which is one of my favorite things, I go deep on
Hmm?
a person's background. I I saw this nugget that I'm like, wait a second. Joe was on the board of Coffee Connection.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, wait, I just listened literally probably less than a month ago. There's a podcast called Acquired. And these two individuals, they've been running for a long time. It's a fantastic podcast. I highly recommend it. But they talk about success stories. They started out talking about acquisitions, but it's morphed into something bigger where they talk about, but anyways, they did an episode with Howard Schultz about Starbucks.
Ah,
And he
okay.
was talking, I'll send it to you. He was
Yeah.
talking
Okay.
about when they finally started to expand, well, they couldn't expand to the Northeast because it was owned by like that area was owned by Dunkin' and Coffee Connection.
Yeah.
And then he was talking about how they acquired the name Frappuccino. I hear these nuggets from the Boston
Oh,
tech scene, and I heard, what? Frappuccino came from a Boston coffee roasting company?
yep.
I didn't know. I'm
Yep.
like, that is
No.
amazing that this is a global brand of Starbucks. Now, obviously, I think of you as more of a tech entrepreneur, but when I found that
No.
nugget,
And
I'm like,
yeah.
wait,
Yeah.
Joe
But
is
see,
on the
that's
board
the
of the Coffee
diversity of
Connection.
there's where I have no focus and I become a terrible role model for entrepreneurs because my obsessive message with them is to focus.
Mhm.
And they look at me and I mean, I've done Coffee Connection, I've done stuff in optics, photonics, semiconductor, quantum computing, AI. I did a company that pumps septic tanks. I was on the
Okay.
board at Boston Restaurant Associates, Pizzeria Regina.
I saw that too, Pizzeria
Say,
Regina.
no, that has nothing to do with 90% of what I do. But I knew the people, they're great people, you know.
So that goes to probably the philosophy of most investors, team, right? Team first.
Well, there I was an investor in Coffee Connection. I was not uh, an investor. Boston Restaurant was really a closely privately held.
Got
But
it.
then I
Okay.
did introduce him to a company that was, we did a reverse merger that got us public.
Mm.
And that is a deal I
Uh,
negotiated for them.
right.
And
So you were on the board. You weren't
I
an
was on the
investor.
board there. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
So
how did you get into investing?
I think,
I have it as
yeah,
iconic
yeah,
2000.
no, it might have been Iconics because I remember Icon, and there, I mean, it was a trivial investment, although in today's dollars, it would have been reasonable. But there, it was an area I knew uh, because I had had some reasonable success in the factory automation area at Cyborg. The entrepreneur reached out to me. I wrote a tiny check. I joined the board, but the bigger investment was he was working out of his basement. And I remember being there once. He's on the phone trying to close on GE, and the boiler in his basement starts knocking and clanging. And I said, "You got to get out of it." I mean, he couldn't set up a meeting with him. So I got him a conference room in Boston, and I actually bought 2 office condos in Foxborough so that he could move there, charge below market rent for the first 2 or 3 years, and had enough space that they could expand if they were successful. Now, that wasn't a pure investment that I hoped to make money on the real estate too, but I never would have done that had he not, you know, buying individual office condos was far from anything I would have done other than me trying to, again, here's me trying to help someone.
Mhm.
And it was, so not only was that the first, it's a great example of how you can build a company without venture money.
Mhm.
He did a great job building that from scratch, never raised any, I mean, tiny bit of money. His mother put up a little money and a few other people. And he didn't raise money until he didn't need it. And he had some big investors, I won't say begging him, but he got Johnson and Johnson, Toyota, or other people to invest when he was doing tens of millions of dollars a year. And that he just exited about 5 years ago. And
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
All right. So if you go through your website and see all the companies, there's so many amazing companies that, popped out at me. But the
There's a
ones
lot
that
of dead. There's a lot of dead. There's a lot more dead ones than there are
well,
amazing.
that's
Yeah.
well, that's part of the deal too, of course. But okay, HubSpot. How did you meet Ryan and or Dharmesh initially?
So again, it's another story about people. I was in an angel group called Common Angels. They were around in the
Hmm.
early 2000s. And the internet was just coming about. And one of the members gave a slide presentation on, it was either the internet, digital marketing, it was something about this new thing. And it was Dharmesh. And I was just blown away. I said, holy crap, this is one smart dude. Dharmesh, let's have lunch. Went and had lunch, telling me his life story. I said, if you ever start a company, I'm in. Funny you should mention that. Now, this
No,
is my record. So here's where memory and
sure.
exaggeration lies come in. So I recall me committing as soon as he said I said I was in. Brian says that it took 60 or 90 days of them beating the crap out of me to get money out of me. So I don't, one of us is misremembering or exaggerating in different directions.
Right.
But I was in that first group, pre-venture investors. Uh, and it was just based on me being very impressed with Dharmesh and then being equally impressed with Brian. I'm not throwing Brian under the bus, but I didn't. But in fact, I upped the amount after meeting Brian, I upped the amount I had committed to. So
And was it the if my memory is correct, was it Dharmesh showing you his blog, his On Startups blog that was kind of like the content marketing engine that they were thinking about?
this is again exaggerated, and I'm trying to make a point.
Right.
They had no idea. I mean, I had no idea what they were doing.
Yeah.
Brian tried to get me to host my website on HubSpot was the very first thing. And what the hell did that have to do? Why? Because they needed money.
Mhm.
And again, this may be, I'm now treading on ice that might be exaggerated distortion
Right.
of reality, but
Mhm.
I had no idea the concept of inbound marketing, had no idea of, although I was impressed. I do remember before writing the check, I asked Amesh whether that blog was going to be part of HubSpot or not, because he had
Mhm.
enough success that even though I loved him, I thought he was fantastic. I wanted to make sure that this other thing didn't turn into a business.
Mhm.
And, he assured me it was all one thing and it would all be one thing. So,
Right. Okay. Well, obviously a success story there of a
but that is the
major
root.
anchor company.
If you talk to Brian, that's one of the things that got his attention. He was a VC. Now, I shouldn't tell Brian stories because this may not be true, but he was a VC who, when he saw, and a classmate of Damesh, and when he saw the activity Damesh was getting, he said, "Holy crap, we invest millions of dollars in a startup to go spend money to accomplish 10% of what you'd have accomplished for $12."
Right. Yeah.
What is, and that is where the concept of content marketing,
Hmm.
you know, bloggers were doing it, and Brian recognized the economic value of what lots of people seem to be doing. And so it
Yeah.
was that catalytic thing. I think, again, let me not tell a
No,
HubSpot.
they created that category. Inbound marketing was not a piece of the marketing puzzle that is a core. It's amazing. Another, Boston created this
Yep.
piece of so another company, um, Roving Software, right?
Oh,
Most
yes.
most people know them as Constant Contact, but
Yeah.
I remember
Yep.
being at an event and seeing, I think it was both Randy and Gail, so Randy Parker and Gail Goodman pitching at one of the mass TLC or whatever
Yeah.
trade
Yeah.
organization, like just pitching the company to the audience, and I'm sitting there listening, and it was called Roving at the time.
Yep. Yep. I remember early meeting there. It was in, I forget whether it was Randy's basement or one of the other, when it was Roving and Gail had nothing to do with the company. And there's a good example. I didn't get it. It was, you know, we have email and you have distribution lists. And so I did not see the picture. I was impressed with Randy, impressed with the team, with what they were doing, but didn't write a check. Gail came on board. I met her and I wrote a check. So here's the thing I've looked at. Kind of thought it was good. I kind of liked the team. I didn't quite get it, but she was a kick-ass product manager. And I said, if she's betting her career on this thing, there must be something here. And I
Eh,
dove
eh,
it. Yeah.
Well, and what they had to go through, because SaaS and subscription revenue models were, especially one that's a price point of an email marketing platform, and what they had to go through to get to scale and to a publicly
And it
traded
wasn't
company.
all up and to the right. They
Mhm.
had a very bumpy period for a year or so. Um, that shows the advantage of persistence. It's funny. That's something you never know. You be persistent because who knows? The next rock you turn over may be the one that's successful. On the other hand, you've seen these caricatures of people banging their head against a wall and they should have given up 10 years ago. And
Yep.
that's a dilemma I to this day don't know.
Yep.
Never, 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 ever give up is one, and the other is know when to quit. And those are two totally contrary things, and they both apply.
Yep. That's a
And
tricky
it is where
dynamic.
it's a flip of the coin. It can be luck, it can be judgment, it can be a whole bunch of stuff. But
So, if anyone is interested in hearing more of the Constant Contact story, Gail was on the podcast before, as was another person I'm going to mention, David Friend.
Ah,
Uh,
David.
so
Okay.
were you an investor in Carbonite only or other companies? Because I mean, his
No,
story.
it's so yeah, boy, I got a story. David, holy shit, that brings. Remember when I mentioned the company I joined after leaving Teradyne?
Yes,
Startup with I joined.
that was Autex, right?
That's no, sorry. It was there was Artex in the middle, but then Cyborg.
And
So
Cyborg. Yes. Okay, got it.
Cyborg was that Cyborg. David, I don't know whether he had just sold. I think it was called ARP Instruments. I
ARP.
think it was
Yes,
yeah,
ARP, the synthesizer
yeah,
that is famous for so many recording artists like The Who and Barbara
yeah.
O'Reilly. Like they're like I was just like,
So
you invented the synthesizer ARP?
so
He's like, yep.
he doesn't to this day. I don't think he ever remembers this, but I that's when I first met him when he had an interest in what this founder was doing. It was a new area called biofeedback. They were doing it. They were really selling devices to potheads to do stuff, and that's where even though I got involved, I couldn't take any of that, and that's why we did stroke and spinal cord. Took the same technology and I directed it towards stroke and spinal cord injury stuff. Um, but I remember being very impressed with him back then, and somehow we never stayed in touch, and he never really even knew each other. But then he was he a member of Common Angels? I invested in Carbonite while I was at Common Angels.
Okay,
Uh,
another happenstance occurrence. This is a story that I heard on a different podcast, but I definitely want to touch on it here too. Was the company Scavenger, um,
yes. Yeah.
Seth,
Yeah.
which people probably know Level Up, but I remember Scavenger. I remember seeing Seth at events, and he was pitching his Scavenger Hunts mobile application in
Yep.
the early days
Yep.
of the App
Yep.
Store.
Yep.
But I remember he was it was like, oh, this kid, he dropped out of Princeton at 19, and then next thing you know, he's on, in Time Magazine as one of the, next Steve Jobs article.
Yeah. So that's what, so there is a theme here. There's another one. I wrote a check to him before he even incorporated. He didn't even have the company yet. And as he tells the story, I'm not sure I remember it quite this way, that he was on his way to run the marathon and he stuffed my check in his sock and he cashed a soggy check later. I don't quite remember that level. He may be embellishing just like I embellish a little bit, but I did write
It's
a
a
check.
good story that way, though.
And I wish I had I tried uh, uh, calling Fidelity to see if they could get me a copy of a check that was 10 years old, and they couldn't do it. But I would love to have just had that check because I would kid with him. This was uh, when the Winklevoss Facebook fiasco occurred, where they claimed they own half the company and he claimed they didn't, and all that. That's what I would kid with Seth. I says, I do own 40% of the company, right? And ha ha ha. And I didn't. I owned a tiny,
Right,
tiny
right, right.
fraction of the company, but it was a good
That's
joke
funny.
because there was no paperwork, there was no nothing. There's in the uh there was
Yet,
just a note, you know,
how,
a
how
note
did you
in the
meet?
in the memo section. Uh but he's a
Angel
great
investment?
example of an entrepreneur. You
Mm.
talk about pivot after pivot after pivot. And another expression I use with people a lot, and it's 90% true. I have never seen a business plan that's been executed. So I mean, do I care? Yeah, I do care a little bit, but the details, these people who do their due diligence and are looking at year four spreadsheet, the gross margin in the fourth quarter, I go, what the hell are you looking at?
Right.
You
Hockey
know,
stick up and to the
I
right.
and it's yeah, so uh
Total addressable market size. Yes, we're going to own it all.
no, but he's a classic example. I mean, uh, he, as I told him when he finally lied, I said, well, at least you're buzzword compliant. You had mobile, you had advertising, you had gamification, you had this and that, but what business are you in? And he didn't know or care. He was going to get kids, college freshmen, to get engaged. And
Now, how did you meet Seth? I think that's a key part of the story.
there's another people-centric story. After Cyborg, I ended up doing turnarounds for about 12 years. The first one was accidental. The second one was introduced to me by an attorney. And the day I went in to begin to run the company, I was told, avoid talking to a particular individual who was an asshole investor, pain in the ass, and I would regret ever talking to him. That guy was Norman Prebech. So first thing I did, after everyone said, do not talk to this person, was to call up the phone and talk to him. He's an investor. I got to talk. I'm not going to avoid him. And this came out later on after he and I talked. I explained the situation. He had some kind of a debt instrument, and we were late on stuff. I says, you're not going to see any money for at least 6 months. And here's why. Here's what I'm going to do. And he ended up thanking me for communicating with him. And rather than hate me for the message, he was appreciative of the message. And so 10 years later, his son was starting a company. He said, we never got to know each other that well, but I trust you. I want you to talk to my son. And so again, perfect. And I can, by the way, I can point to that and give credit to my boss when I was at the typewriter turning down Harvard Business School. Because there is a direct, were it not for that, I would not have ended up doing that turnaround. I would not have met Norm. I therefore wouldn't have met Seth.
One of the portfolio companies on your website is American Fantasy Sports. And I was like, that one, I'm like, what company is that? I didn't know.
There's an example of a bad decision on my, so I was not that American, I was on the board and an investor. I thought he was onto something. Everything we tried to do, attorney general of every state we went to go in, we spent more on lawyers than anything. It was illegal. It was gambling. You can't do it. No, it's a game of skill. No, it's gambling. And the company ended up blowing up. So a couple of years later, a couple of guys from Vistaprint starting a company in the fantasy sports business called DraftKings. I said, I've seen this movie.
Not going to work.
This is illegal. It's not going to work. No, we're different. I said,
oh, no.
You talk to this guy, and if you can explain to me why you're different than what we blew our brains out on, I'll be in, because I was very impressed with Jason and the team. So that's one I should have just invested because of the team. I never followed up with them. They never followed up. But a beautiful example of there's a success would have been bigger than HubSpot. And I didn't do, and that was luck in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so had he told me, we know it's gambling, but here's how we're going to get around it. And we're going to go that I would have been in a heartbeat. But he was telling me it was not gambling. And I said, that's bullshit. It is gambling. I'm telling here's 5 cases where we got sued and we lost. And so it was me not understanding the market and not understanding Jason's unbelievable persistence and passion.
So who is the founder of American Fantasy Sports? A Boston founder?
Yep, a Boston founder, Michael. In fact, here's another strange story. Michael Klebnick is his name. And I just spoke to his daughter the day before yesterday because she's looking for help. And he asked if I could helper. So
I'm sure we could go through each company, and this is what I was hoping. Like, this is a different format than most of my podcasts. Like, this is like what I was expecting. This would be a fun walk down memory lane of you being involved at the earliest stages of these companies that people know about because they grew to where they got to, publicly traded, acquired, or whatever the case may be.
yeah, I always think in metaphor, but the metaphor just hit me that, I do talk too much, and I'm too much of a storyteller, but every company you name to me becomes a link that I can then talk about for half an hour.
You should write a book.
Because you know what, everyone says that, and I had fantasies of doing it, but that takes work. It takes focus, and I just don't. If I had someone come put a ring through my nose and say, Joe, I'm going to spend an hour a week with you, and I'm going to suck it out of you, I could probably do it. But even then, I've got a lot of friends who have written books, and when we see people writing books, you see all the New York Times bestsellers, but the vast majority of books sell 1,000 copies of, nothing.
Right. Yeah, true.
And I don't want to say it's an ego trip, but because I don't want to crap on my friends who have written books, but some have been quite successful. But amazingly successful might be selling 100,000 books, not 10 million James Patterson, whatever.
Switching gears a little bit. So there's been some news about non-competes in Massachusetts,
ah,
like finally going away. Is that happening? Like I wasn't clear as to what
so
actually
I don't,
happened.
yeah, I actually do not know what happened, but you'll go back. I think I did a blog post on this 10 years ago.
Right.
In
Yeah.
my usually dumbed down, oversimplistic way. Should we have it? Shouldn't we have it? There are arguments why we should or shouldn't. And in my typical one-liner solutions, which most of the time they don't really solve the problem. They directionally correct, but not sufficient. My solution to that problem was people should companies should require a non-compete, and the non-compete says you can go work for any place you want unless it's a company that requires non-competes, then you can't work for them. And that was my way of saying no one should have them.
Right.
If you have them and no one else does, you won't be able to get anyone to come work for you.
Right.
And it was a non-legislative way to solve the problem where people would say, oh, we shouldn't have non-compete. And I early on, I thought there was a role for them. But if you look at, to me, one example is iRobot. Had they required non-competes, we wouldn't have the center of excellence we have around robots in Boston. And ultimately, I think they ended up with a better pool from which to hire because they let people go compete. Those people ended up hiring people and training people. And my bet, and I'm making an assertion with zero data, that some of those people ended up as new recruits at iRobot.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think legislation was passed or it's pending that's actually finally going to happen. And the reason
Yeah.
why I brought it up is because I saw your blog post from way back.
Oh, you did?
And
Okay. Yeah. There is one difference. One thing where I wince a little bit is if someone gets trained in double E, they should be able to go practice. If they get trained in something else, they should go practice it. But if they go work for a company that is doing something no one has done before, and they learn a skill at that company in that unique thing, the very first engineers at Intel or Fairchild Semiconductor, they really learned semiconductors from the company, not from Carnegie Mellon and MIT. Now they had the basic skill set. So here's where I get a little wishy-washy as to there should be
IP protection.
some acknowledgement of that. But if I'm an optics engineer and I design a microscope for you, I should be able to go design a microscope for anybody.
Right, but that's where the IP and
Yeah.
copyrights and
Yes.
that all
So confidentiality, absolutely.
right.
But non-compete, and where it's
Uh,
especially obnoxious, and this I have no knowledge of, but I talk about it anyway, is I've read that some restaurants, when they have a dishwasher come, he signs a non-compete that he can't go. Oh, come on,
Come
Charlie.
on. I mean, yeah, I mean that's
You
I
know,
mean, so
yeah,
I've always been against non-competes, probably for the same reason you are, and like
yeah,
Jeff Busking's been very vocal. It's like it stifles innovation
yeah,
because if you're a startup and there's larger companies that just will sue you just because they want to just
that's right.
get you
Yep.
out of business, and they're gonna bleed you. They'll never win, but they're
Yeah.
gonna bleed you dry
No, I
to where
agree.
they will win. Like so, it's not like they could actually win based
But see,
on the
that's one of
fundamentals.
the reasons that I had
Yeah,
thought my dumbed down simplistic solution was that
right.
big company wants to keep doing it. That's great, but they'll never hire anyone from any of the little guys
Exactly. Yeah. So,
because the little guys non-compete will kick in. And at some point they'll understand that the free market is a much better mitigator.
yep,
Uh,
that's how it is in San Francisco in the Bay Area. So, I hope what I read was right. I know it's out there. I just don't know the
yeah.
details. But all right. So, what's going on in the Boston tech ecosystem? You're very much,
I,
an anchor. You're involved. You're out
yeah,
there.
I don't know, a lot of activity. Uh, it's funny. I was just at a founder collective event last night, and we were all talking. Gee, they don't do these anymore. So there used to be, get-togethers of all kinds by the various VC. And I was kidding one of the other VCs who were there. I said, so you guys should go back and say, gee, we should do this. And then when you do it, the guys from this fund will see it and they'll say, we should do it. And we'll be back in the moment. I think what happened is we got out of the habit of getting together personally. And I mean, I look back, when COVID first hit, VCs were saying there is no way they're going to do anything without meeting the team. They're doing it on Zoom or whatever. No way. And then 6 months later, it's, well, we'll meet with them. We will give them a draft term sheet, but we won't sign the term sheet till we meet them face to face. And then about 6 months later, it was, well, we'll sign a term sheet. We'll do a draft agreement, but we won't sign the final agreement until we've met face to face. And I don't know if this is true, but there are a number of VCs who acknowledge they have written checks to people they've never met. And so what was absolutely wacko unacceptable appears to be more, although I think that isn't as much I think the actual wiring of the funds may still, and it may just be more a ritual than a requirement, but
It
I
definitely
can
was
do it if
driven
I'm
by the
writing a small
pandemic.
check, but if you're writing a $10 million check to someone, I have a Nigerian prince who's raising money who would like to talk to you.
Well, I think we are getting back to that reality of face-to-face contact. Like the pandemic happened, people kind of got out of practice and it's been warming back up. And I sense it from companies that we work with. They want people back in the office. It doesn't have
No,
to be every day, but we
it
want
is.
you in the office, 3 days a week or whatever the balance is.
I was just chatting with Tim Rowe about this very subject, and he says
Yeah.
things back like gangbusters. I mean,
Great.
yeah, no, I think some of it is him. I think there's a great example of a guy who was an entrepreneur who did it the right way. And,
Mhm.
for a while, everyone saw WeWork and kind of told Tim what an idiot he was for not doing what WeWork did. And,
Yeah.
you know, who was the idiot? It was
Right.
not Tim.
Exactly.
He's done a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, the
So,
CIC is an important piece of
yeah.
not only Boston, but how they have expanded. It's been very
Yeah.
strategic and smart. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They're all around the globe now. And they get,
Yeah.
I don't know how many locations, but yeah, he's doing real well. And there is a good sense of community I used to see this pre-COVID. I do both WeWork and CIC and Work Bar, and I was like a roaming homeless guy with a sandwich board. But uh, there was something different about the atmosphere at CIC, that
Mhm.
it was more a sense of community. Uh, I was telling, if this is the explanation I use with Tim, you felt more like you were gathering in someone's living room, where at WeWork, you felt you bumped into someone in the hotel lobby.
Yep, that's a good analogy.
You're there, you might even have coffee with them, but there's a difference having coffee at my den versus coffee in the diner or in the cafeteria or whatever.
One of my biggest regrets as a entrepreneur, I started a search firm because that was my background recruiting. In 2002, I was living in South Boston, and I finally was like, okay, I've got some money to go get an office. And I toured the CIC, and I was like, and again, I'm living in South Boston. It would have been
Yeah,
perfect just to take, public transportation. I decided to drive to Burlington, Mass every day. More startups were in Burlington,
yeah,
and because I'm like, I needed parking. And that
yeah,
was my decision. I needed parking. And I look at that back at that decision. I'm like, that was so stupid. One, no one came to see me
yeah.
and needed parking. Two, I would have been the resident recruiter for every emerging startup at the CIC. Like they would have been like, oh, you need to hire? Go to Keith.
You
He's down the
know,
hall. Like, so
we
just,
all have our woulda, coulda, shouldas, and
uh,
and you can't look back, you gotta, I mean, I say you can't. Some people beat themselves up for it, but it,
I drove to Burlington every day.
yeah. Oh, I get it. I can picture it, it's,
Fighting traffic, my decision. I'm like,
yeah,
what? Anyways, it's just a good
yeah,
story. But
yeah.
all right, Joe. Well,
Okay.
thanks so much for taking the time to
Oh,
bring us
great.
through all these
Yeah,
great stories. I could talk to you for hours, and maybe we will do another extended episode
yeah,
at some point. But thanks for all the stories and
yeah.
obviously all the great
Happy to
details.
do it. And yeah, good seeing you, and let's stay in touch.